Gallery, Basement Edition. I'm David Daxon, Artistic Director. What's your name?
Where the good stuff happens.
Yeah, really. Well, the underground stuff happens.
Yes.
I'm David Daxon, the Artistic Director, and I'm moderating this panel called The Future of Creative Music. And with me, Michael Rancic, Rich Brown, Amanda Smith, Jessica Cho, aka Koreatown Acid. So the future of creative music, why have this panel in this festival or in general? We here at the Music Gallery, which is called Toronto Centre for Creative Music, have a series called the History Series, in which we take a look back at creative music in Toronto's history. We had a panel a few years ago with CBC broadcaster Amanda Paris, who talked about why is it that I always hear about all these cool things that used to happen in the city only in things like panel discussions or one-off sort of retrospectives, and there isn't really a history to access of a greater story to be told and connections to be made between different creative music scenes in this city over time. So that got me thinking, since the Music Gallery has been around for 43 years now, we would be in a good position to have the network to reach out to create a series dedicated to looking at some of these histories and making those connections. This has been going on for about 3 or 4 years, and since the theme of this year's festival is forward, it makes sense to look forward to see what might be in store for creative music in the future. And that's why there are 4 panelists from different musical backgrounds who could each have different and similar things to say. It should be a good dialogue. But first I want to talk a little bit about creative music in general, because it sounds good, kind of like the word forward. It's like it sounds progressive, but what does it really mean? Creative music is both a general term and it's also a specific term. Specifically, creative music came from the 60s, from a time in jazz, specifically related to an organization in Chicago called the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, which was an Afrocentric group, a community organizing group designed to encourage original music by the people who were in membership, and they also created a community in which everybody had to either pay dues or attend a certain number of gigs in order to keep this community going. So creative music in this historical context was, in their words, serious original music. And it was rather Afrocentric, very much focused on improvising, but also very interesting compositions, which paralleled a lot of notated music movements in the 60s as well, and generally a very expansive sense of global musical traditions. So the AACM, the Association for the Advancement of Creative Musicians, still is from Afrocentric organization which relates specifically to these traditions. However, around that time, a lot of artist-run spaces and loft spaces that were presenting cutting-edge jazz and free improvising adopted this creative term to describe what it was that they were doing. The Music Gallery was founded in 1976, along with various other institutions across Canada that still exist, like the Western Front in Vancouver, and they call themselves creative music institutions. In fact, New York State has an institution for creative music, which also very much comes from that. And in that sense, it picks up the improvising, contemporary classical, world music 1.0, and sort of post-punk strunk by the end of the 70s, coming out of places like New York, and created it into an aesthetic that was very identifiable in the 70s, 80s, and through the 90s. Since I've been at the Music Gallery as artistic director since 2012, I've tried to respect both the specific meaning of creative music and also expand the definition to basically any kind of music that has a questing spirit that tries to do something that's never been done before. Unlike the historical interpretation of the term, I think there's a wide range of popular forms that can also qualify as creative music, and it sure as heck doesn't always have to be serious music to be creative, innovative, or experimental. That's why on this panel there are these different folks who come from different traditions and have their own ideas about what creativity means to them. And I guess let's get started with reading the bios of what everybody's all about. To my left, Michael Rancic. He is a freelance music journalist based in Toronto. His writing routinely focuses on emerging Canadian musicians and the ways in which federal, provincial, and civic politics influence music scenes. His byline has appeared in Exclaim, Chart Attack, RIP, Vice, Spacing, and The Guardian. Currently, you can find his work in Now Magazine and Bandcamp Daily. He has pieces coming out shortly with Music Works and The Walrus. Ooh, Walrus, nice one. Jess, on the end. Koreatown Acid, named one of Now Magazine's electronic musicians to watch at the beginning of 2019. Koreatown Acid has been creating a buzz on the Toronto circuit with her timelessly cosmic live sets. Using an experimental and purely improvised approach to samplers and synths, Koreatown Acid's expensive. Expansive.
I didn't write that.
Is it expensive? It is
But
pretty
also,
expensive.
just to correct it, it was 2018.
Oh, 2018.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I think you're honorary in 2019. Her rhythms sit at the juncture of dubby house, free jazzy techno, and funky ambient territories. Hypnotic compositions are dexterously assembled as skittering, slowly billowing Technicolor synth jewels. Rich Brown. Electric bassist and composer Rich Brown started his professional career playing in 1992. Since that time, he's released 3 albums as a leader and appears on over 70 recordings ranging from jazz to funk to traditional Arabic and Asian music. Rich has performed with a wide variety of artists, including Rudresh Mahanthapa, Steve Coleman, Angelique Kidjo, Kurt Elling, Kim Mitchell, James Blood Ulmer, Parachute Club, and David Clayton Thomas, just to name a few. He also leads his own groups, Rinse the Algorithm and the Abeng, and was nominated for a Juno Award in 2016 in the category of Jazz Album of the Year for his latest album, Abeng. And Amanda Smith is a Toronto-based stage director and founding artistic director of Fawn Chamber Creative, with whom she commissions, produces, and directs new Canadian operas and interdisciplinary works that correlate new classical music with other art forms. Described as a visionary by Ludwig van, her versatile creativity is demonstrated by her explorations with a wide variety of music, spanning from early music to very new. Regardless of the era, her passion for expanding classical audiences has led her to create music, to create work that impacts eclectic audiences. Amanda has shown this in her extensive work with Tafel Music Baroque Orchestra House Music Series, as well as with the Banff Centre, Stratford Summer Music, Opera Lyra Ottawa, the Iranian Canadian Composers of Toronto, Opera Laurier, University of Toronto Music Festival, Cowtown Opera, Against the Green Theatre, and Musique de Bois Femme. So as you can tell, a really wide range of experience in the room, and let's kick off this discussion. And I should probably start off with a more positive question, but really there's a lot of concern about the spaces and just creative places to do music in Toronto in general. And I think it's probably appropriate to start with the question, what are the worst systemic barriers that hold down creative music expression in Toronto right now?
I think the lack of racial diversity in positions of power is probably one of the top ones that I can think of. Whether it's at like the granting level or through labels or at music venues, that lack of diversity results in lack of diverse performers sort of rising up through the ranks. If you think about the way that it is in the terms of like venues, we heard earlier in the year the issue with Cinecycle, there being an issue with them wanting to book a hip hop related party because they thought they associated it with certain things. I know that Hawaii Mighty, who just won the Polaris Prize this year, she's a hip hop artist, and even though she has all these accolades and critical acclaim, she actually has a lot of difficulty getting insurance to perform because she performs at hip hop shows and insurers won't pay for it.
Wow.
That's wild.
Yeah, it is wild. Rich?
Well, I think there's more emphasis placed on commerce and people just not taking chances on music that would appeal to people. Because everyone wants the names. Like the larger festivals want the names that will fill the seats. I remember in the 90s, it was Ron Gaskin that used to book the Next Wave series at the Jazz Festival, which got ended up booking like a lot of very creative artists from around the world, and you don't see that kind of curation happening in larger festivals anymore. That's for sure.
Ron Gaskin gave me my first big gig.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
He's a great great guy. Amanda?
I was just thinking about your comment about diversity, obviously, in leadership is really important, but leading to on the stage, like trying to make sure that there's awareness and training for people who are young to feel as if they can do these things. You know, I come at it from like a producer-presenter standpoint, and you know, I work in classical music, and we work a lot with experimental electronic music, and even just, it's not to say that diversity, obviously, we know that diversity does exist, but it is more, it's up to people in leadership positions to put even more work into making sure that there's representation in, just like what you do, with making sure that all communities are represented as best as possible. I mean, my hope would be that the more we put these efforts forward, that will become more of a natural thing going as our generations continue.
Jess?
Probably like the real state of Toronto now, although like venues are disappearing and stuff. Or even like just if we had like last call till 4 a.m., then we could definitely have more like artists on the bill, where people kind of like tend to leave after the bar sales are done. So instead of like pushing the like alcohol like sales like starting in the morning, instead of like extend that in late nightlife, I think that could possibly like plug in more artists to more diverse parties.
I think many of you are saying that it's a combination of not enough admixture of people, partly driven by the necessity of commerce, whether it's alcohol sales dominating the music experience, really, in Toronto, and the way that funding happens, and the way that festivals have become like so top down in terms of, I'm sure when we were playing in the 90s, there was more of a middle zone for festivals for people who weren't stars to get paid.
Absolutely.
As opposed to, you know, top headliner getting 25 times what your typical gigging musician would get.
I just had a comment regarding more spaces being needed. Like, this is a conversation that we have had for years, and increasingly so. If the topic is like, how can we foster creativity, like to be able to have platforms for people, spaces for people that, you know, that allow for amplified sound, that allow for, you know, for public traffic to come in, that aren't going to be like hassled by the police, because you have even my concerts have had police show up, and you know, they're classical with amplified electronics, you know, but it can cause an issue in terms of neighborhoods. And I guess this is why we're seeing like shows like Red Bull, which was great. We got to see like a lot of locals play at the same time, but it's quite out of the way, which can be like exciting for people, but it's not necessarily accessible for everyone.
And that doesn't happen every weekend either.
It doesn't happen
very
every
special,
weekend. Totally.
creative.
Yeah. So like, say someone wants to just put on their own show, it's actually pretty hard to do that. There's a lot of risk to put on a show, especially when there aren't really that many spaces that allow for it. Like, I'm always on the hunt for venues, and not just venues that will allow it, but are also affordable, you know, especially ones with pianos. Almost doesn't, it's really hard to find.
You talk about putting on your own shows, that's a point well worth making. I'm sure you remember when I started gigging in the 90s, $5 cover, that's what it was. Now, you're hard pressed to break 10 most of the time. You know, like, so many other costs have gone up, and what people are willing to pay for music has remained below the rate of inflation, for sure. So trying to make your money back, especially when people are expecting more from even DIY gigs now. better production values, gear is more expensive, all that kind of stuff. It just seems harder and harder to have a sustaining kind of series, and I'd like to sort of move into that right now. Touched on festivals as being a place where, I mean, festivals have a lot of advantages. We're in one right now, and it attracts a lot of media attention. It can attract a lot of resources, special grants available. But what are some of the other pros and cons of festivals versus year-round programming, and what that means for creative music? Jess, can you talk about that in terms of the electronic scene, because it seems like that could be really quite segregated in a way between like huge festivals and trying to find stuff that happens otherwise.
Yeah, so what was your question?
The pros and cons of festivals as opposed to year-round programming.
Well, I think if it's like partnership with like a bigger sort of corporate, it's a much bigger production. It's a lot of collaboration between different production teams and a lot of artists. So I think it could be challenging, but if it goes well, it's very satisfying. Versus like if you were to do your own kind of DIY low-key thing, but that also you're just kind of creating your own, so it's also like kind of unique and special in that way too. But I think it's really depending, like the bigger corporate, like the festivals are like bigger exposure to newer audiences, which is always like essential for artists to develop and gain that sort of profile. Like it looks good on the resume.
Yeah, right.
But if you do like small party yourself, you're just building sort of your own branding, which can be like really cool too.
When you do these big corporate festivals, do you find that there are limits placed on what you can and can't do?
Not necessarily, actually. They give like a lot of free booze and free guest lists and stuff. But
Like creatively, could you do?
creatively. No, actually, they were pretty open. I was actually chosen to do like a back-to-back DJ set with a friend, and we have like came out with a plan that we were going to do like a live set, just because we were like opening at 10 o'clock, and we wanna make it something exciting for the audience, which is more captivating. So I just had a lot of like artist development for myself, doing all these rehearsals, and it went really well. So I kind of want to have a regular collaboration with that particular project. So it was like a lot of pros for me. I had a lot of fun.
Do you find that's the case with many of the corporate festivals that, or like the larger scale ones where there's serious investment involved?
Yeah, it's a really bigger production. Everything's very like detail oriented. When I played for the MUTEC festival, they're very professional, and I think it's really actually nice to learn how they do things, because everything has to be very planned out, and it's there's like a technical writer, stage manager, sound person. It's like those like details are very important to make like a perfect performances, and like the lighting that goes into it, and it's bigger sound, better sound.
One of the questions that I had for you specifically was going to be about MUTEC, and MUTEC, for those who aren't familiar, is a festival that originated in Montreal, but now it's worldwide, and it is widely respected as being a festival that encourages creative sounds from all kinds of electronic sources. You know, what you said before about Havai Mehdi having a hard time getting insurance for DIY shows. Certainly, if you're working with larger, or for hip-hop shows in general, yeah. If you're working with a larger entity such as MUTEC or Red Bull or stuff like that, these kinds of questions are much, much easier to deal with all the economic muscle that they can bring, and the legitimacy, and just the ease of dealing with bureaucracy that the hoops that you have to jump through. So given that MUTEC has been like a real important part of Montreal for 20 plus years at this point, could you see something like that working here? I
think slowly but surely. I want to be optimistic about it. I think honestly Toronto has like really like amazing artists that are like super underrated, that creates like live music, whether using like laptop or hardware, and it's not there yet, but it's definitely like I think Montreal is one of the most influential for electronic music in Canada, and Toronto's definitely getting there, but the lack of venues that are like accessible is definitely hurting, but that's why like I think partnershiping with like a like a magazine company like a Vice or something, or like even like the Red Bull, for them to have like such a big production, like 2 rooms curated, all these like there's live acts, there's DJs, and there's like international artists, as well as like showcasing a lot of like original local like creative sound. Yeah, we just have to like partner with the like-minded people who can, but also kind of, or like artist grants, right? Because you wanna throw a party like a Mutech, and their programming is very like very niche, but like amazing. I just been going there for like the last 5 years and discovering so many different artists that I never heard of, and that I would listen to them like for the rest of the year. So it's all about like just exposing those sort of new artists that are like just bedroom producers, or like they don't really play a lot of shows, but they do this thing that's really cool, whether using tape or hardware, or like using like Ableton, like MacBook kind of thing. So yeah.
Sorry, there was a festival here a while ago, like not the same level as Mutech, but there was a festival called Foundry, and that was I think it had 2 iterations, but there was like a whole multi-floor festival at the Great Hall, and that was a combination of, I believe it was Brian Wong and possibly the Mansion crew people, and Brian Wong was actually a pretty big force in like trying to do these like festivals, and there were a lot of really interesting festivals and artists that they brought. From what I've heard, just from these friends, I'm like, it's not my industry, but socially I have these conversations quite a lot, and there's the burnout for producers or promoters is massive, and it's not necessarily sustainable, because even though they're huge and you go to these events, they're still run by just a few individuals, and oftentimes the financial risk is quite high. So, and you wouldn't know, just as like an audience member, you just wouldn't realize. But we have had them here. It's just the individuals may or may not feel like they can maintain it.
Michael, I mean, you've probably written more about venues in the city than music venues, arts venues, than anybody else. Certainly you've heard a lot of stories about both how venues meet their demise, and also people's burnout tales. How would you, do you have any stories that you could share with us about that, or in general?
Sure. I mean, both like, so I'm more familiar with like the DIY, like punk sort of aspect of things. So with Sheebie-Jeebies, which was the punk space up on Geary Lane, and then Faith Void, the sort of record shop / gallery / performance space that followed. Both of those were sort of as a result of burnout, and burnout in terms of the kind of bureaucratic sort of red tape that they had to deal with in order to remain a venue. So in both cases, it was noise that was their demise, and this is unfortunately before we just revised our noise bylaws, so things are much different now. But with Faith Void, the most recent example, it was sort of like a basement venue and residential, 2 stories of residential over top of that, and I guess the people in the building next to them, the building was empty for the first year of Faith Void's existence, and then finally people moved in and then started making noise complaints, not knowing that there was a space there that had been running and was essentially a part of the community on College Street at that point. And so they called and made a noise complaint. They were visited by a noise bylaw officer. They took some measurements, and at the time, the unfortunate thing is that we had this general noise bylaw, which blankets all other sort of noise issues. So even though they were creating amplified sound within the thresholds that they were allowed to do, general noise basically says that if you hear a baby crying across the hall from you, you can call and make a noise complaint. Like, anything is noise under the general noise bylaw. And so that was what did them in, and rather than fighting it, because ultimately what that would involve is likely going to court, the owner, Ryan Tong, just decided to pack it in. So there's all sorts of instances where NIMBYism, like I kind of want to know the person who called the noise bylaw issue on their classical concert.
Well, they get pretty loud actually, so.
Right.
Yeah.
But like, the city's full of it, like, like speaking of exhaustion, just think about like the Matador and what they went through. Like that's like 10 years of trying to like put in a venue in a space that was already a venue previously, but in a supposedly progressive neighborhood. Like they all vote NDP, but they don't want a music venue there. That was, yeah, anyway, so they couldn't do it and ended up having to leave. So now it's gonna be a condo.
But now there's a new noise bylaw that
Yes.
you've just written about. How do you think that will change both venues and what's possible to do in venues as a result of this?
We'll see. I feel pretty positive considering that there's no more general catch-all that exists. So if you're creating amplified sound, you are always going to be looked at through the guidelines of the amplified sound thing, subsection. And there are actual measurements now, whereas before the thresholds weren't really clear, or what time of day those weren't really clear either. So it's more defined than before, and yeah, I'm optimistic that it'll work out and actually help people maintain their venues and stuff like that.
Meanwhile, let's contrast that. I guess I'm casting into the, you and I are the old men of the panel, it's true. Back in the 90s, when we were young and fresh of cheek, how would you describe the club scene and just the music making scene in general in relation to the noise issues that we face now and difficulties with insurance? From my memories, it was a lot just easier to find places to play in general.
For sure,
Yeah.
yeah. There were a lot of different venues in the city, and a lot of venues that were taking chances on different styles of music, which you don't see as much anymore.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, in what way back then?
Yeah.
Well, you would get a wide variety of artists over the course of a week at one venue, whereas now a lot of venues are specializing in one style of music or maybe a couple styles of music. So, I don't know, there was much more diversity, not just in the music itself, but that also fostered great opportunities for each of the musicians in the community to collaborate with different genres outside of their own sort of comfort zones, I guess. So that kind of intermingling doesn't happen as much anymore. And of course the venues are specializing. So it makes it a little more difficult for the growth of the music in general nowadays. Whereas before everyone was just, playing with everybody,
Yeah, that's got to be an important ingredient in creating new music, is you've got experience with a lot of different types of genres, and you're a gigging musician. That's something that sometimes gets lost in today. Like you're in a band and maybe that's the only thing that you do. But if you're a fantastic bass player, then you've got lots of different opportunities for employment, and you've got to learn a lot of different styles and come up with your own thing.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a little bit less common now.
Well, being a little bit older, I'm in a bit of a fortunate situation in that like I've sort of established myself on the scene. So the phone rings for me. So it's going to be a lot harder for younger musicians to find those same sort of diverse opportunities in the scene. Yeah, I'm not sure what to add to that, but
Jess was talking about how UTech has been really good and productive and encouraging growth at all kinds of different levels. If you were to contrast to jazz festivals, I guess there's the one big one, but there are other things that happen throughout the year. How would you contrast how jazz festivals happen as opposed to what she was describing about UTech?
in what sense?
Do you feel like, for instance, the Toronto Jazz Festival encourages that kind of musical activity in all kinds of levels that UTech would?
I don't see that
Yeah.
in this festival, and I say that from an interesting perspective because I was actually on the board of the festival for the last couple of years, which basically meant that I could suggest different artists to the festival, and they would look into those artists and book them or not book them, in my case. So I don't see as much of that happening in the festivals now, which is incredibly unfortunate. There are many opportunities, not just for the festivals themselves, but it's also a great opportunity for the audience to check out some music that they would not be familiar with otherwise. And that's mainly the reason why the scene can potentially stay so stifled, because everyone sort of stays in their zones. It's a sad state of affairs in that respect.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'd have to agree with that. You see smaller jazz or improvised festivals like the Tone Festival or Women from Space, which just started last year. These are fantastic artists, mostly local artists, who it seems like it hits a bit of a brick wall when it comes to
Yeah.
a larger stage.
It would be great if something like the Next Wave series would happen now, with maybe some of these smaller festivals collaborating with the Jazz Festival to put on their own sort of thing as part of the festival, because the festival is when people like show up. And they show up, and even people here in Toronto, they show up and they say, "Oh, I didn't know this music was out there."
Okay.
And then the festival's over and they go home and you don't see them for the rest of the year.
Yeah. Well, one part of music in which that's different is classical, opera, and contemporary music, because we tend to organize ourselves in terms of seasons. So presumably, continuous musical exposure can happen over the course of a year, as opposed to just being concentrated to a weekend in a year. But how would you, Amanda, compare this part of Toronto's music scene with what you've been hearing from the other panelists?
Well, I can completely relate to what you're talking about in terms of like the siloing and that being a real issue. And I mean, this is actually my own personal feeling about it. You know, like I studied classical music, I went to opera school, and I just felt like, and I was very interested in all the new music that was being created, but I just really felt like everyone was so stuck in their world. And not every individual, but what I found was that like when really exciting things happened, it was like people who were reaching out outside of our immediate community, because you know, it's just like you go to school together, you read the same texts, you study the same people, and yeah, I think it's really important to collaborate not only with other musical artists that are in different genres, but just other art forms.
Absolutely.
In general. You know, there's a huge thing in classical music of like, how do we get new audiences? How do we get young people? And you know, it's not about doing the same thing.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so that's basically what, that's like the whole reason behind Fawn, like the company that I started way too long ago. And like our whole thing is that, you know, we want to create new work, we want to collaborate with other artists, and the hope is that we stumble upon some exciting material that's not just for people in our industry. You know, that we're putting on, in terms of collaboration, we're putting on this concert series this season called Convergence Theory, and it's all, the only big like theme is experimental electronic music and classical and non-classical. And like my real hope is that, you know, audience members from both sides and people who are just like, well, that sounds interesting, come and they hear the connections between the different genres. And then not only just for the audiences to overlap and meet each other and discover, but also for the artists. It's really my hope that people will get talking and possibly, you know, that's how collaborations start. So you never know, like if you just like put people in the same room and you introduce each other's music to each other, you never know what's gonna happen. And I do a lot of collaborative work with, you know, bringing classical and electronic music together. And it doesn't make it any less classical or the other. It's just, it is what it is. And it becomes something really exciting. And you don't get stuck, if you're siloed, then you can get, it's not with any one genre. It's literally like pop music, every genre has traps, right? Every genre has like
Especially trap.
I went there too.
Yeah, but you know, there are sort of like socially agreed upon formulas in some contexts of music, and in notated music, there are formulas that you are literally taught. But what I hope in terms of like the growth of creative music is that people just take that as a foundation and not as a rule, you know, and then see what happens. Like, it's good to have a foundation because then you know what rules you can break and what rules you really want to break. Yeah, I'm pretty like driven by that exact mandate of just trying to get people talking and creating together.
That's an interesting point. Would the rest of you feel that way about aspects of your musical practice, that you're out there to help, I guess, build community is what you're talking about? How much of a role does that play in your own work? Let's start with the journalist.
Wait, what?
Because usually,
How
much is that
like
built-
musical practice?
Yeah, but you know, like how much, we had actually one of the history series discussions was about the role of journalism in creative music, and how years ago there was this brick wall between journalists who's supposed to be the impartial, objective observer and the things that they were covering. I don't think that's the case anymore, and a lot of what you write is very activist. So how would you describe what you do in terms of encouraging community in the scene?
There's a lot of blur, like you were saying, in the community, in part because like other journalists are also musicians, and then you end up writing about them, and so you can't draw that line anymore. I think it's kind of a result of the internet and no one being an expert anymore. Everyone's an expert, sort of thing. So if everyone's an expert and everyone can write, then you're not going to have those clearly drawn lines of objectivity that used to like exist, or people used to pretend existed. As far as I don't even know where to draw that line myself sometimes, because like there was I created a petition recently because there was somebody who was transphobic and racist, who was going to be put on a Toronto Music Industry Advisory Committee. And I thought, okay, I can like sit around and wait for this to be a story, or I could just make a petition and then make it so that this person doesn't have the seat, and I can actually write about maybe some of the good things that the committee does. So I decided to pass around a petition, so I just went around to different shows and I put it out online, and a lot of people signed it, so I was very happy with that result. And I didn't feel like I had crossed a line, because it felt kind of shitty to wait for something bad to happen.
Yeah. Even 10 years ago, people would have got fired for that. So,
Sure.
Yeah. So good. I'm glad you're still employed.
Me too.
Rich, you now have a radio show
I have a radio.
on jazzcast.ca. Tune in. Is that another tool in your arsenal of trying to do what you do and help the people who should be helped?
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. I try on the show. I try to play things that are might not be familiar to people, but at the same time, I'm also trying to. You mentioned before the foundation, so I'm also trying to provide the foundation that sort of paved the way for a lot of the music that's happening now, because I think the foundation is ultra important if we want to move the music forward. There's that saying, you gotta know where you're coming from if you want to know where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, the show provides that sort of lineage of the innovators from yesteryear and where that has sort of led today. And it's cool to see a lot of that happening with young musicians who are also taking chances on trying some different things and incorporating different sounds into the tradition of jazz, which wasn't as encouraged when I started playing. So it's great to see that now. Problem is, we get back to that same issue of finding venues for these people, because it's harder to categorize them in a world where these venues are specialized. We only do jazz here. We only do this here. So opportunities for these younger musicians become difficult.
Jess, I know you've curated shows before, and you just champion people. How would you say that you use your own talents to create community?
I think I pay attention to like what the other people are doing. So it's like going to check out like their shows and just like, you know, trying to find the connection. And if you naturally feel connected, and then like there's a future collaboration and spending time like jamming with your friends to sort of explore like different musical adventures. And also it's like, you know, you kind of like give to the community, they give back, you know, if you support their shows and like they'll come to see you, and I think that's a very big part of like the community, and like as a performing artist, as you feel the same, I hope. Yeah,
I guess you've partly touched on this as we led into it, but is there anything further you'd like to add about the position of Fawn, or what you see in other people in the classical music opera scene trying to create community and create opportunities?
You know, yeah, actually I had an interesting thought that it's connected to this, but one of the questions that you sent, and you were wondering like about how creative music, how notated music can have creative music. How can it be creative when it's notated? And I thought, I was thinking about like how when you notate music versus like improvised and all of that more collective way of creating, it's music that's made for other people to play. It's music that's made to like bring, it's no longer a part of you in the same kind of way as if it was made specifically just for you. And I've thought about how that actually, in a way, I've never really thought about it before, but just that act is actually an act of community. You know, like a piece by, you know, a Montreal composer can live and be performed across Canada, across countries, and those people that are performing it, the people that are hearing it, they all become sort of part of a community who have experienced this music. So I don't know if that's not exactly what you were asking me, but it was something that I was like, well, community almost just happens. I mean, you have to foster it in other ways, but community happens with just like within classical music, because it's like, oh yeah, I played that, you know. Oh yeah, I heard about that composer who's like, you know, miles away, but you feel this like sense of belonging, which is kind of interesting, because like I was really thinking like how does it make it more creative or less creative, or you know, but I started getting away from that and thinking more about like how, yeah, it actually can strengthen community, you know. The way that I try to foster community with Fawn is, as I said before, collaborating with different people. So as an example for convergence theory, it's not enough just to program different people. You need some like partners, like community partners. So I approach David Jones, who, you know, he's very active in like the experimental electronic scene here, and very much part of like the community of it. And so I asked him to join us and be a co-curator, so that not only is it about us bringing these musical worlds together, but also we have someone who's a community leader who would be able to be a voice in these concerts. So that, you know, I try to find different ways to do it, and just knowing that it's like not really just up to me how it's done. So trying to like communicate to other people and get it from, you know, if you're trying to integrate other communities, you have to work with those communities.
I just thought about something. I think within the electronic music, like the DJ producer culture, the form of like community thing is like when you like share your like work, like your recordings that are like maybe unreleased or forthcoming, and then people download them and like play them at their radio show or their gigs, and they post it, and then some other DJ is like, oh, what's this track, and then like that sort of like gets big, and then it's like your friends like helping out for exposure. Like for instance, like Machine Woman, she's amazing producer, and I'll always play her track, and or like she plays like my track at a radio show, something like that. I think that's a really big sense of like community and creative music within, especially the like current electronic dance music.
It's nice to see people talking about inspirations. Maybe we can turn it into, start off with what are the barriers, but where do you see hope in Toronto's music scene? Where do you see some building blocks? This seems like a very concrete example. I think like SoundCloud could, you know, obviously never have existed 20 years ago, and the ability for that to form community both within the local space and worldwide. That would be something that helps a local artist who might otherwise be trapped in a silo leapfrog that and you know, find other spaces to go. Where else do you see hope? Mike?
I see hope when when I see people organizing and responding to things that are happening. So one of the examples I can think of is when Not Dead Yet, a punk promoter in the city, threw an event to raise money for the Parkdale rent strike in support of it. Or they did another event for the Toronto Overdose Prevention Society. Like these are ways in which we can, as like a musical artistic community, address and like reach out to other communities that we're interconnected to. And I sort of feel like, because I talk so much about like the venues question, seeing people organize around that and sort of resisting the sort of cycle of here's a new venue, then it closes, let's find another venue, then it closes, and trying to find creative ways and solutions around that. So I'd like to see more of that sort of happening, maybe in some sort of like coalition between DIY promoters or smaller venues and stuff like that, so they can have more of a voice and like a seat at the table for something like TMAC.
Rich? It might be a cheesy answer, but I actually see hope in the youth and a lot of the young musicians coming up.
Do you believe the children are the future?
I believe. Teach them well. But I teach at Humber College, and I also am really blessed to have the opportunity to go to Banff and join the faculty for the creative music program there almost every year. And I see such incredible creativity in these young musicians. And I also see that idea, especially at Banff, of community and collaboration, which is like so important to the growth of the music in general. Because especially at Banff, where you get these participants getting involved with the program from all corners of the globe, when they get together in their own ensembles and they exchange ideas and bounce different concepts off of each other, and how receptive they are to each of these new ideas and their willingness to step out of their own comfort zones. It really, to see that firsthand, makes me excited to see what the future of the scene will actually be, as far as the creative music and the music that will result from these collaborations. It's exciting, and I don't know, I feel like when I was starting in the scene, that, I may have said this already, but that kind of thing wasn't encouraged enough.
You're talking about being on the faculty of Humber now. When we both started on the scene, Humber was probably best known for churning out Wynton Marsalis's clothes. Like, you had to wear sharp suits.
Yeah.
You had to play that 80s, like, straight ahead 50s redux jazz, and I feel that's not happening anymore.
Well, I mean, there's still that. And I can see why, because the foundation is important. But I like the fact that, you know, last year in Humber, I was part of the jury that adjudicated the recording projects that the students were handing in for their fourth year projects. And I heard straight ahead jazz and pop music, country. I heard a metal band that was killing. Like, I love that. I love that that's happening at Humber. And then when I go to Banff, like the last time I was at Banff, it was myself and a number of jazz musicians on the faculty with me, but also a DJ from Haiti.
Was it
Val
Yeah.
Gentil, yeah.
Yeah.
She's incredible.
Yeah.
And like a rock and roll guitarist from New York who was also really great. And they all had equally important ideas that they were able to contribute to the program. It was fantastic to see that kind of diversity, not just in the faculty but in the participants as well. It really made for some great collaborations. And that makes me hopeful. That's where I see hope.
Cool. Amanda, you spent time at Banff as well, or?
Yeah, actually, I find it interesting because like they have everyone's sitting in the same like cafeteria, like buffet.
Yeah.
I always found like they tell you that they want everyone to mix and talk to each other, but no one ever does.
There's a certain segregation that happens.
No one ever does. It's like there's scientists
Serious
over there, and
yeah.
everyone just kind of like, oh, okay.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because it's more so at like the watering hole. You start to talk to people,
Yeah.
you know, later at night, and people start to kind of like blend their conversations, and you hear what other people's projects are doing. Yeah, it's pretty exciting.
And in Toronto, like, what would you see as being really hopeful in that regard?
Yeah. I guess I'm gonna like bring a bit of pessimistic perspective first. I mean, but it'll end positive. But the idea, like, you know, people talk about classical music, it's dying, you know, companies are folding, opera companies are very expensive to run, there just aren't a lot of opportunities. And as a result of this lack of industry support, career support, there are all these like new companies popping up, and so there's this I think there's like 12 of us maybe, but we have Indie Opera TO, and it's all these different companies that are all doing very different things. and we all kind of come together and we share stories and kind of like have each other's back. And as a unit, we try to have a stronger voice. Was it you that were, you were talking about bringing together venues and, so we're trying to do that, having a stronger voice as a group. But it's exciting. Like every year there are new companies that are popping up, and I have my own frustrations with the old guard, which is I guess why I do what I do. Not that it's all legitimate, but it can't be exclusively that. And what's popping up is like a response to that. So I think it's actually creating more options for audience members and more options for artists to figure out like what kind of artist do I want to be? What kind of creative music do I want to participate in? So yeah, that's kind of where I'm focusing right now.
Just.
I feel very optimistic about it, especially given like how Red Bull Music Festival turned out. As long as I think we support each other within the communities and encourage each other and take the risk and really focus on like why you're creating these events, and it's to showcase like different eclectic like creative music, instead of like getting too trapped on like bar sales or like like charging $40 at the door, which is actually very common for cover nowadays to go to like a DIY rave.
Yeah.
That's a lot of money,
Yeah.
right? So, I think a reasonable ticket pricing, what people are enticed is like, for instance, last night it was $20 and there was like 3 international headliners with like 5 live acts and local DJs that are really like participated, involved, and very like busy, hot like DJs right now that are like kind of leading the Toronto underground dance music scene. And also, like collaboration with the right branding, like partners, like, Red Bull, like government funding, like support, like support from like the alcohol company or like different like production teams, and to make it like more like accessible to people and really focus on the showcasing different sound.
Yeah, I would say that's one thing that's really changed a lot since the 90s is the nature of corporate involvement. I mean, not that there still aren't like really poorly constructed events which are meant to showcase the brand more than the music, but back in the day, any kind of involvement with corporations would be branded as a sellout immediately. That was the rock and roll attitude, and there are these different ways to go now. And Red Bull is definitely one of them. There are other issues with Red Bull, of course, but generally on the music side, they tend to be very encouraging and very knowledgeable about the people they've dealt with. Because that's been my experience as well. Most people who I've heard who've dealt with them, it's generally been not evil, at least on an individual level.
I mean, I think also like you just have to like think about the programming is very important, because nowadays the music is so accessible that like you can just go on Spotify or like SoundCloud and YouTube, and people check out so much music that like they're very trend sensitive, and they wanna hear like if it's like a really great programming and bookings, and like people will come and I think support regardless. So it's like it's making that like sort of storyline within the bill that's enticing people to open their wallet or like open their ears.
There's 3 points that I want to make before turning it over to some Q&A. One of which we've talked before about spaces and how things are being pushed further out. I feel like that's a matter of perspective. I mean, there's 3 million people who live in the city, and most of them don't live downtown. It kind of goes without saying that we think of the music scene as being a downtown-based thing, but I see it as a potential positive as things move out. That cultural activity happens more and more in the city, and that can only help draw newer people into the scene from a further, more diverse geographical area, which is only a good thing, really. And there's also funding initiatives. I'm on the music committee for the Toronto Arts Council, and there's a program called Arts in the Parks, for instance. There's also arts in libraries. That these things never used to exist, which bring not only culture from downtown, but culture from uptown to downtown, and these interfaces that are really well constructed that can create creative situations like never before. This also turns into, we've talked about diversity, which is such a loaded term from time to time, and having more genuine interfaces in a wider geographic area over the city can only make these encounters more meaningful and create true fusions or hybrids, because it's happening in an organic way that never could have happened before. And a third thing that is a priority now, it's not in evidence everywhere, but I think that it's helping to create a more equitable playing field, is the drive towards safer spaces for music. Because it's one thing to want to attract new people to a scene, but if that scene is hostile to them or hostile to your voices, particularly hostile to women, then that will drive people away and discourage people. And again, not that every space is safe, and it's not even about a safe space, but safer spaces. But in order to actually take a look at how things are constructed, how people communicate, how the music gets made in the first place, some people might portray this as like policing a good time, but really it's creating conditions, winning conditions for everybody to enjoy the music and everybody to participate in music. So I think that these are also signs of help, signs of hope in the city. So yeah, I can mull all of these things over, but I'd like to throw it over to the floor to see if there's any questions for the panelists or any comments about what they consider to be good, bad, and indifferent things happening in the city right now.
Hi, so I am on kind of the policy end of all this very loosely, and I do want to say like this is like one of my primary interests, but I hear this conversation and I look back at kind of my general field, and I can't help but think that there are like crises everywhere. So this is not to say that this is like non-important, that's not what I mean at all. What I'm trying to say is I'm curious about your take specifically on like this idea of like the larger issues feeding into the issues in this area.
Sure.
So when I think about development, the venue issue, I think about affordability, right? And I think about just a lot of other issues, like for example, you're talking about the racialized aspects of a lot of these venues, then I just think about the state of policing, right? It's like kind of all just ties all together. So I think there's like a good middle ground to be found, but I'm curious what your take on this is as someone who's in it.
Sure, I think music is a good way to have a sense of how these things play out, like in the sense of the vanishing music venues. We don't have a lot of data on affordability in the city, but seeing the way that those businesses are disappearing gives us a metric to look at the loss of culture that's happening because of all of this unfettered development. And so that's how my perspective when I'm coming at this. I'm like a music journalist, but I'm using it as a way to talk about these bigger issues. In terms of, what was the other part? Like
I just meant
structural, like racism?
Yeah, I guess that wasn't really my question. My question more is just about kind of this idea of like, I guess I didn't really vocalize my question, but like whether like the steps to take are small in this area, or like we kind of just need like the solution isn't a wholesale overhaul kind of thing.
Well, kind of when I was talking about like hope, I think that there's future in like partnerships. So there's a lot of great people who are doing a lot of important work in terms of like affordability, housing. Like housing is a public health issue. It's a environmental issue. There's so many different things that it touches, and we know that with artists, they're living. A lot of them are marginalized people, and they don't have access to funds, and some of them don't even have time to like work on their music all the time because they're working 3 different kinds of jobs. So music is just a way for us to look at how these things are issues are affecting people. And I would like to see more partnerships between the musical community, because we still live in a city that where the politicians see things through that Richard Florida creative class sort of lens.
The economy.
Right.
So important for the economy.
Yeah, and we don't have to value things through that lens, but we understanding that they do means that people in that creative class can leverage that and use it as a way to have the ear of policymakers.
So likewise, coming a little bit from the policy angle, but much like the folks on the panel spent an inordinate amount of time thinking about the sort of systemic barriers around a lot of this discussion, but increasingly I find myself thinking about what I'll call the consumer side problem, and it was touched on a little bit by yourself near the end there, but I'll kind of hammer the question home with an example. We were at Red Bull last night, and we complained plenty during our hour-long commute to get there, and then we realized that, you know, in places like New York or Berlin, the hour-long trek to Berghain or wherever, it's ritualistic, it's expected, and so I'm wondering in a time where the sort of ethos of convenience is changing consumer side habits so much, how do you folks think we might battle that? Because there are the systemic sort of larger scale political issues, but then there are also individual habits. To put it in another kind of blunt way, like I'm realizing increasingly that my friends and myself are lazy when it comes to our support for the arts, right? We're just not showing up the way we arguably should be. And sometimes that's because our wages are low and because there are systemic barriers, but other times it's just because we're conditioned to be lazy. And so I'm wondering if there are some thoughts on how to change that side of the equation.
I have some thoughts on that, because I think when it's most effective and you have to like go out of your way is when it's made to seem like an adventure. You know, like you go and you're like walking down an alley, you don't know if you're actually supposed to be there or not, is this the right place? It's fun. And you know, when you make that part of the experience, and I'm speaking from both a producer, because I try to have an essence of that with my concerts, but like it's because when I go to these like these dance music shows and I have that experience, I'm like, this is cool. Like it's cool from like the moment that you're getting in an Uber or taking TTC and you're getting there and you're like feeling like you're some sort of warrior, you know? But yeah, like making it clear that it's part of the experience. You know, it's kind of a fun thing.
There's also the idea of like bringing the mountain to Muhammad, so to speak. Like, what venues would be available close to where you are that maybe you would be able to organize a concert or an event that would allow us to come to you? That could be an option as well.
I do find that like specifically with my company, depending on where I put the concerts, people will or will not come.
Mm-hmm.
So like, and maybe this is because of our audience, but putting on a show or an event on the East End, I'm gonna have a really, really hard time. Putting on a show, we did an opera up on DuPont, Geary. And I mean, we had people come, but like the complaints, you know? Oh, I have to walk up from the bus, you know? but it's still there. I have to be really conscious about where we put our shows, and it's not because of like cool or not cool, or will people be able to, will they want to go? I'm still at a point where like, although I'm trying to create that like ethos of the funness of finding a place, but geographically it actually still needs to be, for my shows, they still need to be more central or west, or else we just don't get the numbers and then we lose a ton of money.
Yeah, Feast in the East has been telling us we've been lazy for however many years now. It's a trek to cross over the Don River, but it's worth it when you do make the trip. And so, yeah, it is really difficult to try and get that message across. But I guess to sort of Jessica's point about earlier about the 4 a.m. last call, Amsterdam made their last call. I don't think they have one. I think it's a 24-hour licensing thing now. But the venues that are licensed are outside the city center. That was like a crime thing, but it was also a way to drive people out from the downtown core. So I feel like you need to, if you want to drive culture further and further out, you also need to have the infrastructure to support it. And over there, they just bike everywhere. That's part of the culture. We're not quite there yet. So to have like other kinds of buses to support us going outward would be very helpful. Other forms of transit, because when we talk about like the nighttime economy, that's one of the things that one of the pieces that needs to fit in order for that to work is how are people getting home? How are people getting home safely? Not even to the place, but like back from there.
Yeah, like the subway ends at 1.
Yeah, yeah. How are we gonna have a 4 a.m. last call if we don't have that? But yeah, so yeah, I feel like we need to like do all these things at the same time in order for it to work.
Montreal has a 6 a.m. I don't know if they still do. I don't know if anyone knows this, but a couple of years ago they implemented a 6 a.m. last call, and not every bar people can choose whether or not they're going to be open that late. But I'd be curious to know like what that as a case study looked like.
Also on the consumer side, I feel that pricing plays a big role, and we are generously publicly funded, and I think that one of the important things for us to do is to keep prices at a certain level so that it's accessible for more people. We're really lucky that we're this close to the subway, and that was a big part in having moved a couple of years ago. But it's really in defiance of the whole return on investment priority that arts funding advocates and opponents would hammer on. It's like, let's keep the prices low. We don't have to make our money back at the door. You could the pay what you want idea of charging cover, where you could have people pay a toonie up to $75 for a concert if that's what they can afford, is an interesting one too, in terms of trying to convince people to act in a certain way. So those are potential ways forward. I think that it would be great if one thing that's almost entirely missing in Canada, which exists a lot in the States, is individual donors and private foundations. Which, here there's more public funding, which has rules and consistency attached to it more than foundations and individual whims. But the plus side of having foundations and individual donors is that a lot of that cost pressure is taken off and can help influence consumer behavior that way.
Yes, from the perspective of the audience, I'm interested in the issue of aesthetic accessibility. And I've been impressed with the role of media, podcasts and radio, in helping me understand what it is that I'm going to be listening to, and to create interest in what I'm going to be listening to, so that what I'm going to be hearing is no longer outside my zone of proximal development. It's no longer noise to me. It's something that I can understand and I can appreciate more. And I wonder if there's any kind of concerted effort in that regard regarding educational institutions or media.
Well, talk about Jazzcast for a bit. I mean, that sort of addresses that.
I think with respect to Jazzcast, like have you listened to that?
I haven't heard that.
Jazzcast.ca is sort of a 24-hour jazz station, but not just jazz. Like it goes right across the board with a lot of different styles of music. And the aim is to open your ears to some new sounds while still giving you sounds that you're already familiar with. So you're able to sort of stay within your comfort zone, but then that comfort zone slowly gets expanded.
So I've certainly heard podcasts like Hooked on Pop, where there's an intellectual framework that is presented to allow me to understand what it is that I'm hearing. And sometimes CBC Radio does that as well, where there's an upcoming show and where it's a bit unusual, but they'll have somebody who can interpret what's going on. And I know that for new music, there have also been educational sessions to explain what this is all about and to provide a vocabulary that was not within my realm previously. And I found that helpful.
Find that festivals are focusing on outreach events more than they used to, and they're better constructed than they used to be. We make a priority of keeping almost all of our outreach events free, so that there's really no barrier to coming and learning more from an eclectic group of people. So that's another way to provide context, particularly local context for music that might be out of your comfort zone.
You sit on the Arts Council, you said?
Yep.
And you fund certain functions, which brings up a strange question about the Jazz Festival. I don't know what happened to it, but it was very successful at City Hall for a number of years. And this year they moved it up on Bloor Street, and had to close the street. And you're listening, you know, like on the pavement in a confined space, so on. And I'm just wondering, you know, if you know anything about it, like how it just has sort of fizzled out. And, you know, seems like a real shame. They had Mill Street Brewing, I think, sponsoring it to help it along, and TD Jazz, right? TD Bank funds all the jazz festivals in Canada, but I don't know what happened this year. It just was terrible.
I don't think it's an Arts Council thing, but there was a change in upper management, and I think that the new, what's his title, executive
It would
director?
be nice to be able to complain to somebody.
Yeah, complain to them, I think.
You know, when I went to TD Bank and I tried to leave a letter and ask them, and nobody knew who runs the TD Festival circuit. Like, there was no contact person other than having to go to Josh Grossman, who actually runs the festival. And I'm kind of like give him my complaint, you know, like about how poorly he organized it this year, you know. And I just felt like so stupid, you know, that I may as well just forget it, you know. I'm pissing in the wind.
Yeah, well, certainly a bold experiment to move it to where it is now.
It was terrible.
yeah.
I mean, you know, it should be, you're talking about venues and stuff. I mean, a beautiful park would have been so nice to be able to lounge, bring your lounge chair, sit in a park, drink beer, listen to jazz.
I don't think it was all by choice. I think part of the reason was that they weren't, I don't know if this is for sure, but I don't think they were able to get the proper permits or whatever it would have been to allow the festival at City Hall again.
Well, it's
I've
been
played
there
the
for like 10
fest-
years. I don't know how come all of a sudden the city would revoke their
Yeah, I'm
Wasn't
not-
there construction at City Hall at one point that caused it to move?
I think so, yeah.
So that was part of it.
I've played the festival in both areas of the city, and I much prefer City Hall as a musician.
You played this year up in Yorkville?
Yeah,
I mean, it was terrible, wasn't it?
it's not
Not the
not
same.
ideal.
It's not the same.
It's far from
just not-
ideal.
It's not happening. It's, you know, it's just pity.
Crystal?
I have a question from Facebook,
Facebook.
Oh,
Whoa.
wow.
the land of Zuckerberg. I'm talking about big corporations like Red Bull. Why aren't we getting together, creating co-ops, and divesting from big corporations? Or have any of you seen evidence of things like that happening in Toronto?
Wow. Co-ops. Well, I want to take it back to my Arts Council experience, but it's nice to see organizations like Not Dead Yet and Long Winter getting public funding really early, and they're people who know how to run those festivals, and not just speak the language of what funders want to hear, but also I can tell you in the jury room that those juries have changed in terms of what they're looking for, and the concept of punk arts has kind of exploded as a funding priority in the last few years. So that's one way to get around going to a corporation like Red Bull. In terms of collectives and co-ops, can you think of anybody?
Not really, not anyone that's doing anything on that level, and I think that's the incentive. I mean, if there was an alternative, I think incentivized to take that route. But people are turning to Red Bull because they offer such a high standard, high production value, as Jessica was saying. And the thing with like especially electronic music, you can't just play, you just can't like plop a PA down and then pump your stuff under that. You want to be able to sound good because it's all about people's experience, and that costs money. And Red Bull seem to be the only people who are willing to foot that bill at this point in time.
You made an interesting point about possible collectives with venues.
Right.
And unless that happened, I don't see that pressure, financial pressure of like trying to get corporate sponsors to go away, because it's just expensive. Like whether or not, if you have a collective of companies or artists that are putting on, they still have the same financial responsibilities. You have to have vendors. So either it's going to be vendors who are getting marketing opportunities out of you, or they're vendors who are just giving something to you in kind, which may or may not be a marketing opportunity as well. So unless you just have to have vendors, or else like ticket prices are going to be continuously rising and just inaccessible.
I've got time for one more question. No?
You have
Sorry?
Yeah.
Was there somebody in the back that I missed?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry, I didn't see you there.
In George W., artist, filmmaker, musician, in reference to access, what I've found is a good idea is when you see a storefront that's vacant, a lot of times it's vacant for months. If you talk to the real estate agent, a lot of times they might give you that venue for artistic impression, whether it's music, art, or affiliated with both. And as far as I'm concerned, that should be going hand in hand anyways, artists with musicians, because not only is it visual, but your perception is broader if it's got both, right?
Yeah. There's an organization, presenting organization called It's Okay, which has done a few shows, which is exactly about that, looking for spaces that aren't being used and turning them into venues. They're pop-ups, but it's still pursuing that kind of aesthetic, which is really exciting to see.
I've had thoughts about that, because how do you plan far ahead in advance? Like you have to have shows that are maybe a month out, a few weeks out. You couldn't have like a season planned, and sometimes you like really need the security to know that you're going to have a venue because of the scarcity. I have thought about those kinds of opportunities, because I think that was just a cool idea to go in some like a unused space, very rave.
Another way of not restricting yourself is there's a few people, and it's based out of Trinity Bellwoods Park and Kensington Market, is you have people with bikes that have been super fortified with a lot of batteries, and they can play whatever they want, and they're mobile.
Right, there is a problem with that though, because you actually, in order to have amplified sound in a park, you need a license. There are a lot of rules around that, so it's not actually so simple just to do it. I mean, you could do it and just be willing to be kicked out. Like, you could do that.
They're gonna kick out a few hundred people?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seriously? I've never seen it happen.
I have.
It happens.
Dozens.
So it's just to say, like, as an organizer, these are all risks, and you're putting a lot of money, and you want to make sure that at the end of the day, you aren't personally responsible for thousands of dollars, because you want to make sure that no matter what, you're paying your artists, right? No matter what. So, at the end of the day, like that fee, that risk falls on someone. So having a potential of either getting kicked out or renting one of these places, which I do think the idea is cool, but what if, they get a rental? What if someone wants to rent that place, and all of a sudden you're not a priority because you're only for one day, you get kicked out, and then you have no venue, and you're like 2 weeks before your show, when you really should be focusing on other things.
Do you know the bank at Bathurst and Dundas has been vacant for over a year?
Yeah, I mean,
You know that place?
it's not to say that it's impossible. It's just to say that it's a very scary prospect
If
for
you're
a
gonna have
producer.
a positive attitude, you're negative about everything, it will never happen.
Sure.
True.
I mean, there are other ways.
I have.
Okay, so we are just about at 7:30 here, and we should probably wrap this up. So thank you very much for everybody who's come to listen and participate in this conversation. And I hope you stick around for the concert upstairs. Doors are opening right now, in fact.